was a cold, quiet evening in December. Emily, a 12-year-old girl with curly brown hair and bright green eyes, was home alone for the first time in her life. Her parents had gone to a nearby town for an urgent meeting and promised to be back by midnight. "Don't worry, sweetie," her mom had said before leaving. "Lock all the doors and windows and don't open the door for anyone. We'll be back soon." Emily nodded confidently. But as the sun set and darkness wrapped around the house, she began to feel uneasy. The big old house felt so much larger and emptier without her parents. To distract herself, Emily decided to watch a movie. She turned on the TV in the living room, wrapped herself in a blanket, and grabbed some popcorn. The movie was funny, and for a while she forgot about the silence creeping through the house. But then, the power flickered. The TV screen went black for a moment, and the lights dimmed. Emily froze, clutching her blanket. After a few seconds, the lights came back on, and she laughed nervously. "It's just the old wiring," she whispered to herself. She decided to check the house, just to make sure everything was fine. She walked to the front door, checked the lock, and then went to the windows in the living room, all locked. Feeling a little braver, she moved to the kitchen, where she checked the back door and windows. Locked, too. Satisfied, Emily returned to the living room. But as she sat down, she heard a soft thud. Her heart skipped a beat. "Probably just the wind," she muttered, though the words didn't make her feel any better. The sound came again, this time louder. Thud, thud. It seemed to come from the upstairs hallway. Emily stared at the staircase, her palms sweaty. She didn't want to go upstairs, but curiosity got the better of her. She picked up her phone and turned on the flashlight. Step by step, she climbed the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the top, she saw nothing unusual. The hallway was dim, with shadows stretching along the walls. Then she heard it again, a faint rustling, like someone brushing against fabric. The sound came from her parents' bedroom. Emily's hands trembled as she pushed open the door. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn. She shone her flashlight around the room. Nothing. "See?" she whispered to herself. "It's just your imagination." As she turned to leave, the closet door creaked open. Emily froze. The door had been closed when she came in. Slowly, she turned back and aimed her flashlight at the closet. It was empty, except for her dad's old suits and a stack of shoeboxes. But then she noticed something. One of the shoeboxes was lying on the floor. It hadn't been there before. Feeling a chill crawl up her spine, Emily bent down to pick up the box. As she did, she heard a faint sound behind her. It was a soft, raspy whisper. "Emily." She screamed and spun around, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows on the walls. In the dim light, she thought she saw a figure standing by the window. But when she grabbed the flashlight and shone it there, the figure was gone. Emily bolted out of the room and ran downstairs, her heart racing. She grabbed her phone and dialed her mom's number, but there was no signal. She tried again and again, but the call wouldn't go through. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out, plunging everything into darkness. Emily's flashlight was the only source of light, and its beam seemed so small and weak in the vast, blackened house. Then she heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the upstairs hallway. "Who's there?" Emily shouted, her voice shaking. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, this time heading toward the staircase. Emily backed away, clutching her flashlight. She ran into the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife she could find. "I'm not scared," she yelled, though her hands were trembling. The footsteps grew louder. Whoever or whatever it was, they were coming downstairs. Emily crouched behind the kitchen counter, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She pointed the flashlight toward the kitchen doorway and waited. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. Silence. Emily held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the knife. Then, a shadow moved across the doorway. "Go away!" she screamed, her voice cracking. The shadow stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then slowly the shadow disappeared, as if it had melted into the darkness. Emily waited, her ears straining for any sound, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no whispers, no creaks, just silence. After a long while, she gathered the courage to peek out from behind the counter. The doorway was empty. Tears streamed down her face as she ran to the front door. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking, and finally managed to open it. She burst outside, gasping for air. The night was cold and silent, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty road. Emily ran to her neighbor's house and banged on the door. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived there, opened the door, looking concerned. "Emily, what's wrong?" "There's someone in my house," Emily cried. Mrs. Henderson called the police immediately. When the officers arrived, they searched the house from top to bottom. "There's no one here," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. "Everything is locked and there's no sign of forced entry." "But I heard footsteps. I saw a shadow," Emily insisted. The officer gave her a kind smile. "It's easy to get scared when you're alone, especially in a big house like this. Maybe it was just your imagination." Emily wanted to argue, but she was too tired and scared. Mrs. Henderson offered to let her stay at her house until her parents returned, and Emily gladly accepted. When her parents came home later that night, Emily told them everything. Her mom hugged her tightly, assuring her that she was safe now. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the house with her. And as she lay in bed that night, staring at the shadows on the walls, she thought she heard it again, a faint whisper. Emily sat upright in bed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Mrs. Henderson could hear it from the next room. The whisper had been so faint, like it was carried on the breeze, but unmistakable. Someone or something had said her name. She turned her head slowly, scanning the small guest room. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting pale light across the floor. The room was quiet, too quiet. "Just a dream," Emily muttered to herself, though she didn't fully believe it. She lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and squeezed her eyes shut. But the moment her eyelids closed, she felt it, a presence, heavy and cold, like someone standing right next to her bed. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to look, but something deep inside her told her she had to. Slowly, she turned her head toward the side of the bed. At first, she saw nothing but shadows, but then her eyes adjusted, and she saw it, a figure, tall and dark, with no face, just standing there, staring at her. Emily gasped and scrambled backward, nearly falling off the bed. "Mrs. Henderson!" she screamed, her voice breaking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, as though it were waiting. Footsteps pounded down the hallway, and Mrs. Henderson burst into the room, flipping on the light. "Emily! What's wrong?" Emily pointed to the spot where the figure had been, but it was gone. The corner was empty, nothing but a blank wall and a chair. There was someone here," Emily stammered, tears streaming down her face. "I saw E.E." Mrs. Henderson sat on the bed and wrapped her arms around Emily. "It's okay, dear. It's okay. You've had a rough night and your mind is playing tricks on you. Let's get you back to sleep." Emily shook her head violently. "No, I don't want to stay in." Mrs. Henderson sighed, then helped Emily to her feet. "All right, you can sleep in my room tonight." Reluctantly, Emily followed her. The old woman's bedroom was smaller and cozier, with thick curtains and a quilted bedspread. Mrs. Henderson tucked Emily in and sat beside her until she finally drifted off to sleep. But even in sleep, Emily wasn't safe. She dreamed of the dark figure, standing at the foot of her bed, its head tilted as if watching her. In the dream, she couldn't move, couldn't scream. She could only stare as the figure slowly raised a hand, pointing at her. When Emily woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise. The warm light made her feel a little braver, but the memory of the dream lingered. She didn't want to think about it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been just a dream. Her parents came to pick her up later that morning. Her mom hugged her tightly, and her dad apologized for leaving her alone. Emily didn't tell them about the figure she had seen, or dreamed of, in Mrs. Henderson's house. She didn't want them to think she was losing her mind. For the next few days, everything seemed normal. Emily returned to school, spent time with her friends, and tried to put the terrifying night behind her. But strange things kept happening. At first, it was small, things being out of place, like her books falling off the shelf or her bedroom door creaking open on its own. But then, one night, as she was brushing her teeth, she saw it again. In the bathroom mirror, just for a split second, She saw the figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. "Stop it," she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of the sink. "You're imagining things." But deep down, she knew she wasn't. The figure didn't want to be ignored. Over the next week, it appeared more often, always in the corners of her vision, always disappearing when she turned to look. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like before, but she could make out the words this time. "Emily, come downstairs." She sat up in bed, her entire body trembling. She didn't want to go, but it felt like she didn't have a choice. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her out of bed and down the dark hallway. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw the front door standing wide open. Cold air rushed in, making the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The whispering grew louder, urging her to step outside. She walked to the door and peered into the night. There, at the edge of the yard, stood the figure. It was clearer now, no longer a shadow. Its body was tall and thin, with long, spindly arms and fingers that stretched unnaturally. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless. "Come," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. Emily felt a pull, like invisible hands were dragging her forward. She stepped outside, her bare feet sinking into the cold grass. Her mom's voice snapped her out of the trance. She turned to see her mom standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear. What are you doing out here?" her mom demanded, running to her and pulling her back inside. Emily looked back at the yard, but the figure was gone. I don't know," she stammered. Her mom hugged her tightly. "You're not sleeping alone tonight," she said firmly. Emily didn't argue. She knew she wasn't safe, no matter where she was. The whispers didn't stop after that, neither did the sightings of the figure. It followed her, always watching, always waiting, and Emily couldn't escape the feeling that, one day, it would finally catch her. And when it did, she didn't know if she'd ever be able to come back. Emily's nights grew darker and more suffocating with each passing day. The figure's presence was no longer limited to her home. It began invading her school, the grocery store, and even the playground where she used to feel safe. At first, it stayed in the shadows, lurking at the edges of her vision, but as time went on, it grew bolder. One afternoon, Emily sat in her room with the curtains drawn tightly shut. She had stopped talking to her friends and didn't tell her parents much about what was happening. How could she? They would never believe her. Her phone buzzed on her desk. It was a text from her best friend, Lily. "Hey, haven't seen you at school. Are you okay?" Emily stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Emily, I'm fine. Just feeling sick." She put the phone down and sighed. She wasn't fine, not even close, but how could she explain the truth? That something otherworldly was haunting her, pulling her into darkness. The whispers started again that night, soft and insistent, like a chant coming from all around her. She stuffed her ears with her hands, but the whispers grew louder, more demanding. "Emily, come outside. It's..." "No!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed her pillow and threw it at the shadowy corner of her room where she felt the presence. "Leave me alone." The room fell silent. For a moment, Emily thought it was over. Then her bedside lamp flickered, and the shadows in the corner seemed to... The figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. This time, it didn't vanish when she turned to look. It was fully there, standing at the foot of her bed, its head tilted to one side, its long, spindly fingers reaching toward her. Emily couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. The figure leaned closer, and though it had no face, she could feel it staring at her, feel its icy breath brushing against her skin. "Emily," it whispered, its voice a low guttural rasp. "You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to me." "No!" Emily finally managed to scream. She scrambled out of bed and bolted for the door. She ran into her parents' room, shaking them awake. "It's here," she sobbed. "It's in my room." Her dad grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed and followed her back to her room, her mom close behind. But when they opened the door, the room was empty. "Emily," her dad said gently, lowering the bat. "There's nothing here." There was. I swear, it was standing right there. She pointed to the foot of her bed, but the shadows were still now. Her mom knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her face. "Sweetheart, you've been under so much stress lately. Maybe we should talk to someone, a counselor, or—" "I'm not crazy," Emily yelled, pulling away. Her parents exchanged worried glances. That night, they let her sleep in their room. She lay between them, clutching her mom's arm, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind made her heart race. At some point during the night, she opened her eyes and saw it again. The figure stood in the corner of her parents' room, its head tilted, its long arms stretching toward her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, didn't whisper, it just stared at her, as if waiting for something. When she blinked, it was gone. The next day, Emily stayed home from school. Her parents insisted she rest, but she knew rest wouldn't help. She needed answers. She spent hours researching online, typing in phrases like shadowy figure, faceless monster, and haunted whispers. Most of what she found was useless, urban legends, ghost stories, and cheesy horror articles. But one post on a paranormal forum caught her attention. A user named Shadow Seeker had written about experiencing something eerily similar. It starts with whispers and shadows, then it gets closer. It feeds on fear. If you let it, it will take you. The only way to fight it is to take back your fear. Don't give it what it wants. Emily's fingers trembled as she typed a reply. "Emily, how do I stop it? It's everywhere. I can't escape." A reply came almost instantly. "Shadow Seeker, stand your ground. Show it you're not afraid. It's a parasite. If you stop feeding it, it will wither and leave." Emily read the words over and over. Stand her ground? How could she do that when she could barely breathe in its presence? That night, she decided to try. She didn't tell her parents what she was planning. She knew they wouldn't understand. When the whispers began again, she sat up in bed, clutching her flashlight. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, though her voice wavered. The whispers stopped abruptly. The room grew colder, and the figure appeared in the corner. It stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Emily's hands shook, but she forced herself to stand. "You can't scare me anymore," she yelled. The figure paused. For the first time, it seemed uncertain. Emily took a step toward it, her fear slowly turning into anger. "You don't control me. You're not—" The figure let out a low, guttural growl. It reached for her, but its form seemed to waver, like smoke caught in the wind. "I'm not afraid of you," she screamed one last time. The figure let out a horrible, piercing shriek and dissolved into shadows, disappearing into the darkness. Emily collapsed onto the bed, shaking and crying, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. The whispers didn't come back after that night. The figure was gone. But sometimes, late at night, Emily still feels like she's being watched, and she wonders if it's really gone or just waiting for her fear to return. Weeks passed, and Emily tried to convince herself that the figure was gone for good. It had been a struggle, but standing her ground seemed to have worked, at least on the surface. She went back to school, spent more time with her friends, and even started sleeping in her own room again. For a while, everything seemed normal. But the feeling of being watched never truly went away. Every shadow felt darker, every creak in the house felt louder, and sometimes, when she was alone, she could swear she heard the faintest whisper of her name. One evening, as Emily sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet street, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard. Her heart skipped a beat, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She rubbed her eyes, trying to convince herself that it was just the fading light playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew. It wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her fear to return. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional soft creak of the floorboards. Her parents were asleep in their room, but Emily felt far from safe. She felt the same cold dread she had felt before. The darkness seemed to stretch out around her, alive, closing. She told herself to stay calm. "You're not afraid," she whispered, repeating the mantra from before. But no matter how hard she tried to calm herself, Her fear only grew stronger. The whispers returned, soft at first, just a murmur of her name, but they grew louder, more insistent. "Emily, we're waiting." Suddenly, the air in her room turned cold. The shadows deepened, and the corners of the room seemed to shift, as if they were no longer fixed in place. Emily's heart raced. She sat up, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Stop it!" she yelled, but her voice trembled. She turned to look at the corner of the room, and there it was. The figure standing taller than ever, its long limbs stretching toward her, its featureless face leaning down toward her with terrifying "No!" she screamed, scrambling out of bed. This time the figure didn't hesitate. It followed her, its shadow stretching and distorting as it moved toward her. Emily backed up against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind raced. What had she missed? What had she done wrong? She remembered the message from Shadow Seeker. Don't feed it. Her fear. It was fear that had brought the figure back. Fear that had given it strength. She had let her guard down, convinced that it was over and now it was back. But she wasn't going to let it win this time. No, Emily whispered, more to herself than to the creature. I'm not afraid of. The figure's shape began to distort, flickering like a broken image on a TV screen. It let out a low, inhuman growl, its form flickering as though it were being torn apart by invisible hand. You don't control me, Emily said, her voice steady now. I'm not afraid. You can't. The figure reached out, its fingers nearly grazing her skin, but Emily stood her ground, her chest rising and falling with each breath, as she repeated the words over and over. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. The figure recoiled, its body flickering faster, losing its shape. It screeched, a sound so deafening that Emily pressed her hands to her ears, her knees buckling as she sank to the floor. The world around her felt like it was cracking, like the very air was shattering under the weight of the figure's rage. But Emily didn't move. She stayed still, refusing to give in. And slowly, the figure began to dissolve. Its shadowy form faded away, and the temperature in the room returned to normal. The air became still again, and the whispers stopped. Emily stayed there on the floor for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Finally, when she felt it was safe, she slowly stood up and turned on the light. Her room was empty. The shadows were normal again. She stumbled toward the door, barely able to stand, and opened it. Her parents were still asleep, unaware of the battle that had just taken. The next morning, Emily woke early and went outside. The sky was clear, and the sun was shining brightly. She stood on the porch, taking a deep breath. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. But the peace didn't last long. That evening, Emily returned home from school, exhausted but relieved. As she opened the door, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The house felt different, cold and lifeless. She heard a soft rustling from upstairs. No, not again. Her heart began to pound in her chest. She called out, but there was no answer. Tentatively, she took a step forward and reached for the stair. And that's when she saw it, the figure, standing at the top of the stairs. Its long, spindly fingers were wrapped around the Emily, it whispered. Its voice no longer a low rasp, but a hollow echo. In that instant, Emily knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to run this time. She wasn't going to cower in fear. With a burst of courage, Emily marched up the stairs, her eyes locked on the figure. She felt a fire burning inside her. I'm not afraid, she yelled, her voice ringing out with strength and defiance. The figure shuddered. Its form wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind, but it didn't vanish. It stood there, staring at her, as if it couldn't comprehend her resolve. And then, with a final scream, it dissolved. This time, Emily didn't feel it lingering. This time, she knew it was truly gone. She stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, breathing heavily, but her heart was no longer racing. She had faced the darkness and stood strong. Emily. The next few days were eerily peaceful. The whispers had stopped. The figure had vanished, leaving behind only the memory of its cold presence. Emily, though exhausted from the battle, began to feel like herself again. She slept through the night without fear, and her mind slowly returned to a place of. Her parents noticed the change in her. She was more relaxed, more like the girl they remembered before the nightmares. Emily told them everything about the figure, the whispers, and how she had fought it. At first they were skeptical, but they saw the conviction in her eyes and the peace in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. One evening, after dinner, Emily sat on the porch with her mom, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the warm breeze carried the scent of summer. For the first time in months, Emily felt free from the terror, free from the weight of her fear. "I'm glad it's over," Emily said softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "But I don't think I'll ever forget what happened." Her mom smiled gently, putting her arm around Emily's shoulders. "You're stronger than you know, sweetheart. You faced your fears." And Emily nodded, her heart light. She didn't need to dwell on the past anymore. She had faced the darkness and come out the other side. Later that night, as she settled into bed, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. The shadows in her room were just shadows. The silence was just silence. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. But as her eyes began to close, she heard something. A soft whisper. It was distant, almost like a memory. Her heart skipped a beat, but this time, she didn't panic. She didn't "I'm not afraid," she whispered back, her voice steady. The whisper faded, and the room grew quiet again. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily drifted into a peaceful sleep, knowing that the battle was over. The figure, whatever it was, had no power over her anymore. And if it ever tried to return, she knew she would be ready. As she slept, a faint, almost imperceptible breeze stirred the air in the room, just a whisper of movement, but it was gone before it could be felt. And in that moment, Emily understood something important. Some things may linger in the shadows, but they can never truly harm us unless we let them. She had won, and the darkness had finally, completely, faded away.